Hello everybody, this is BKC back in from the depths on the engine test platform, or my engine test platform, not the. And today's going to be going to try to keep it pretty quick. And what I want to go over today is essentially where ejector motors are useful and where they're not useful. Injector motors, like we went over before, injectors make twice the power of carburetors for the same space, but they have a mechanic to where they use, like, I think 3 times more fuel or something like that. I don't know if it's 3 times more fuel per horsepower, or is it just 3 times the power overall? 3 times the fuel overall, meaning 1.5 times more than a carburetor per, 100 horsepower. But that's not what's important. What's important is the block. What the block does is it adds a heat mechanic to your motor, to where when the motor's running, the motor gets hotter, and the hotter it gets, it becomes more efficient. And it wouldn't be bad if because when the use case for an ejector is, I don't care about fuel economy, and if they just would get more efficient, as in they would just use more fuel, we wouldn't really have a huge problem, because you don't care about fuel economy anyway. But what they actually do is, you're trying to get the most power. Is what an injector is good for, is to get the most power out of a small motor. And what the injector does, it adds a well, all motors do it, but the more fuel that they burn, the hotter that they get, and then so injectors are easier to make your motors overheat. So an injector, I tend to stay away from them and not really use them. But the benefit of an injector is, if I take a motor, probably like the Hypercube over here, if I took this motor, this carburetor touches 3 cylinders, so it makes 300 horsepower, which is more horsepower than what an injector can do. Okay, so an injector, the bad thing about an injector is that they only have 2 connection points. You can only connect them, I think, here and at the bottom. They can't connect any other way. So the most that an injector can make is 400 horsepower. The most that a carburetor can make is 500 horsepower. And the reason a carburetor can make 500 horsepower is because a cylinder can connect to all 5 sides of the carburetor and make 100 horsepower for every connection. So technically, a injector is limited to 400 horsepower. And a carburetor is limited to 500 horsepower. Now, if you would actually make a 400 horsepower carburetor motor, or not the motor, I'm talking about a motor that has 1 carburetor and it's drawing from 4 sides to make 400 horsepower, versus a injector to make 400 horsepower, you would see that the fuel consumption on the injector would go up. The fuel injector would be higher fuel consumption. So the same motor, if it was the exact same design, it would run hotter. And the only use case scenario where I can see where I would use an injector is, which is a mindset that I see, or a logic problem that I see a lot of new people to the game run into, or even some experts, they want to get a lot of power in a small area. So the logic would be, okay, we're going to build us this motor here, and we want a lot of power. We don't care about nothing else. And I'm going to build it vertically because it's easier to see. And we're going to put a cylinder on it. And we say, oh man, I want maximum power. I want the most power. And since injectors make 200 horsepower per block and carburetors are only 100, let me connect 4 carburetors on this thing. I mean, 5 injectors on it. 5 injectors on this thing. And oops, I clicked off of it. Fuel engine, injector, and put one on the top. So theoretically, we're making 1,000 horsepower, right? But the motor won't run because the motor is hot as hell. It is so freaking hot that it won't even run. It instantaneously overheats. Okay, now will the motor make 1,000 horsepower? Can we actually get 1,000 horsepower out of a single cylinder? Yes, you can. You absolutely positively can. But let me show you the problem with that. And it's going to take a little while, so I'll probably edit this out because it's climbing down by like 1% a second. Okay, now notice that the motor made 1,000 horsepower for literally by the time it responded and made usable power. It probably made usable power for 1,000, about a second. It made 1,000 horsepower for 1 second. And theoretically, you could use this. Since in real life the motor would be burned up, the engine would burn up, the rings would burn, you know, whatever. This thing technically you could use that if the power response was a little bit faster. It would overheat faster also, but you basically get about 1 second at 1,000 horsepower. Now, if you can convert that into charge, rate, you could have 1,000 units of power for 1 second. And if you had multiple of these things doing this, you could put a pretty good chunk of charge in into your batteries. But we need to see about how much fuel it uses, and I don't even know if the fuel normalizes. In the amount of time that this thing takes to overheat. So I'm going to look at the fuel rate and see what it is to see if this is anywhere close to efficient. I don't think it is. I think it goes through the roof. 13.2 fuel a second is what it looks like it kind of steadied on. But technically you could use this motor if you just charged with it, because right now if you put it in a boat and you was using it to drive your propellers, you'd be sitting dead in the water, and without an electric backup you're pretty much screwed. Now we can cool this motor in 2 ways, okay, to speed up how long this takes, because it seems to take about 1 second. When it's really, really hot, it seems to take about 1% per second of cool down, and then as it gets toward below like the 25%, it seems to take a little bit longer. So one way we can cool this thing is get rid of one injector so it doesn't use as much fuel, and put one of my most favorite pieces is the exhaust pipe. And if we come in here, we notice that the temperature drops a lot quicker, but it still overheats. And we have limited You see how much quicker it cools down? It cools down a lot quicker. And the fuel usage has gone down to 10.6. So, but the maximum horsepower has dropped down to 800. Okay, so it's because it's overheating. It's not even, it's the amount of power it's putting out has extended over a longer period of time, but the power that it's output, I'm sure if you would average out all this power output over time, I think you would find that the longer time, this making less power over a longer time is more useful than that 1,000 power over a short period of time. And it's cooling down faster, so my propellers run longer, or I get more charge into my batteries longer. So this would be more useful. So the logic behind an injector is to get the maximum amount of power in the smallest amount of space, but it's creating a lot of power, and it's using 8.3 fuel a second, which is for 8.3 fuel a second, I can run this motor at, I could run this motor at 6,400 horsepower, and I think I got one that does 3.6 over here somewhere. No, not that one. I got one over here that somewhere around here that's 3.6, and it's which one is it? Or maybe is it this big one over here? I'm not sure. There's one on this platform that, oh, it's this one. This is not the most efficient motor in the world. It's actually a G-rated motor, and it draws 3.6, but it makes 1,600 horsepower. So that would be 64, 70, 8,000 horsepower I can make in the same amount of fuel consumption that this thing makes, that this thing draws before it overheats. Okay, so if we're trying to charge batteries, this thing would be useless. Okay, so if we continue down the road of, well, okay, maybe I was being stupid trying to get 1,000 horsepower out of an injector, 1,000 horsepower out of a single cylinder, we say, well, maybe we'll give it some more cooling because one exhaust helped. I'll just copy and put it, doesn't really matter. Let's put a second exhaust on it, and maybe I was just being too dumb, and let's put a second exhaust on it. Now, with the second exhaust and dropping the power, what theoretically should be 600 horsepower, right? We've dropped the fuel consumption down because the injector is not dumping as much fuel into the cylinder, but we should technically be making 600 horsepower. Notice we're just barely keeping into the range at 93% heat soak that lets the motor continuously run, and the fuel consumption has gone down, but we should be making 600 horsepower, and if we were making 600 horsepower, it would be a good gain. It would be a very, very good gain because we would be making 600 instead of making 1,000 horsepower for 1 second, or making 800 horsepower for a second and a half. Making 600 horsepower continuously is the way to go. It would be the way to go because we'd be putting 600 units of charge into our battery, and the motor would never overheat, and it would be a good thing. But look at our power. Look at our actual maximum power. Our actual maximum power is only 356 horsepower. Well, if an injector makes 200 horsepower per cylinder, an injector makes 200 horsepower per cylinder, that you connect it to, what is the point of this third injector? Because I'm not even making enough. I'm not even making the power that 2 injectors should use. So this is my point, that I'm not even making 300 horsepower when I should be making. I'm not even making 400 horsepower, which would be 2 injectors worth, with 3 injectors. So this last injector is actually costing us fuel. So let's go ahead and get this injector off of here, and we'll see what happens. Okay, our power, our heat is coming down, and we're not losing any power. We're still making about 350 horsepower. So our fuel consumption has gone, our fuel consumption has also gone down. We were at 8.3, and then we went down to 7.9, and then now we're down to 5.3. Why is that? Because as the temperature of the motor, see, now it has stabilized. Nothing's bouncing around, and so it's stabilized at 62% heat soak, and it is running a lot more smoother, and we're getting 351 power out of it from 2 injectors, so we're only losing about 49 power off of these injectors. So this is pretty good. But since we've opened up another connection for an exhaust, let's go ahead and put one on there and see what happens. Okay, so now we got 3 exhausts and 2 injectors. Look how our power is going up. Our power is now going up. Okay, we were sitting at 351, and it looks like the temperature is going to stabilize around 42% with 385 horsepower. So even though exhausts do not add power, this extra exhaust has kept us from losing power. So theoretically, you would never want, well, you can't use, if you're trying to make a small powerful motor, putting more injectors than 2 per cylinder, you're missing the boat. You're severely limiting yourself, and this is basically what I would consider the maximum power per cylinder of an injector motor, 385, because we lose a little bit of efficiency in the heat soak, which is not that much. It's only 15 power. It's not that bad. And the fuel consumption is 5.3. So I'm not really concerned about the fuel consumption per second, because my 6400 horsepower motor over there uses 5 power per second, and this is using roughly 5 power per second. But this is making 350. That's making 6400. So anybody wants to argue that a injector motor is efficient, I can't agree with you. If you want to argue that it makes more power in less space, I can agree with you, because this is a 3x3x3 motor that makes 350 horsepower. I don't have any motor on here. The smallest motor I have is a 3x3x4, and it only makes 100 horsepower. That's the smallest motor. And then the next most powerful one for its size is this one's a 3x3x4 that makes 200 horsepower, and I would have to extend it out another to get another 100 horsepower out of it. And the smallest motor I got that beats it, this one makes 300, but it's a 4x4x5, and this one makes 400, but it's a 3x5x5. So this is probably the most power dense you can get a motor, in my opinion. A single cylinder motor, a 3x3 making 350 horsepower. And if you take the 3x3 is 9, that's 27 blocks of space. That's 27 blocks of space, and theoretically it's really you could almost like if this was the deck of your ship, and you had to put this up on here, technically you could kind of sink the motor block down one block in the deck and make it a 3x3x2. You could kind of cheat it a little bit. So this would be the most powerful dense, because at 385 horsepower divided by 27, it gets us a density of 14, about roughly 14 and a quarter, and that pushes above a lot of even efficient motors. You know, this one's a 16, so it doesn't beat that one, but it's beating this one. Is beating no, it doesn't beat this one, but most of my motors range about the 8 to 10 density, and this can beat it in density, but you know, it's pretty good density, but it's not something I would really use. The only use case scenario I could see for this is if someone said, okay, I want to build a little bumblebee jet, and what I call a little bumblebee jet is usually about an 8 to 10 block long jet. Maybe that's like so tiny it just barely fits the motor. It barely fits the motor that it needs to run. It flies really freaking fast, and it usually either has like one little bomb drop. You know, it has its AI in it, of course, that it needs to fly, and it has maybe like a bomb or a single missile that, or a simple machine gun, so it can dogfight. And its role would be to just fly around really fast and tie up some of the anti-air, tie up some of the enemy's anti-air weapons. So maybe one of my thruster craft or something can just free reign the sky. And honestly, you really can't control that because it depends on how the enemy's AI is set up. But that would be the main thing. It's just an aggravation craft, and so you would, you know, it's low block count, so you can get your ships in plus a whole bunch of these little things to aggravate the enemy, and as they're flying over the enemy, they're dropping a bomb, or if they're, you know, with a thruster craft or something, they're flying around behind a thruster craft and shooting a missile into it where it doesn't, you know, it doesn't have its protection. And that's really all the only use case scenario I should see for this motor. And this is probably how I would build it. I'd put all the exhaust into one, and or I would put the exhaust out the top. I'd put this T connector out the top, and so you could lay this thing down and just let the exhaust pipe hang out the bottom of the craft, and then that way you could fit this thing into a 3 by 3 by 2 space, and that's the only use case I say, and this is pretty much how I would build it. And the thing I want to show you about the logic loop most people get into, what we have here is a the same motor, but I wanted to connect radiators to it to show you how inefficient radiators are. And what I did to get, since radiators can't connect directly to the cylinder, and I'm trying to get all 4, even if I could connect them to the cylinder, I'm trying to get all 4. I'm trying to get 800 horsepower out of this freaking thing. And so I needed a crank, which lowers the density. Well, actually the density would be higher if I could do it. If I could do it, this motor would be, if I can make all 800 horsepower, if I could get this thing to function in a 3 by 3 by 4 block at 800 horsepower, that would be 800 divided by 36, and that would be a density of 22. that would be pushing the density probably about as high as you can go. And so a 22 density making 750 horsepower. Yeah, this is a 21.3 and it's making 6,400 horsepower. But I will concede that you can't put this thing in a bumblebee jet. So but that's not the point. The point is we're trying to get 800 horsepower because the cooling, I put the cooling on the top to help cool it, because if I don't put that exhaust on the top to help cool it, it really overheats, and I can't get the cylinder to stay cool enough to even show how ridiculous radiators are in the first place. But what this is an extra crank block, so I can connect radiators to it front and back. And then you can see injector here, injector on each side, and then there's an injector right here. So this thing has 8 injectors and should make 800 horsepower. So let's see what it does. And it should stay really cool, because I got a lot of radiators and an exhaust. So let's run this thing. We're making almost 800 horsepower. If it would stay at that, that'd be pretty acceptable. That's pretty good. That's not bad. Okay. Well, we stayed at 784 horsepower. 784 horsepower, and we're only 34% heat soaked. And we're drawing 11.9 fuel. That's not terrible. That's not the worst in the world. That is acceptable. But what is not acceptable is the density of this thing. Let's figure out the density of this thing. This thing is 6, well, that's 3, 6, 7 wide. I'm going to have to write this down, because 7 wide by 3, 1, 2, let's see. 3 times 4 is 12 wide. And it's, I think, 3 deep. Yeah, 3 deep. 3 deep. Okay, so we got 12 times 7 times 3 equals 252 blocks, and we were making 784 horsepower. So 784 horsepower divided by 252 equals a 3.1 density, and it's not efficient. Okay, so a 3.1 density. Let's go see where that compares on our engine. This is the worst engine I have on the chart, and this is a 2.2, so it's still beating this, because that only makes 100 horsepower. It's beating this because that only makes 100 horsepower. There we go. This little 300 horsepower single cylinder motor is beating out that thing in density. Okay, so you're making more power in less space than what that thing can do. And this one is beating it out a little 200 horsepower. So it's got a 3.3 density. So can we fit 4 of these in the same space? And 3, so that would fit. 12 would have to go to 7. You could definitely fit 3, but just the odd spacing of that makes the and I could probably choke this in a little bit by putting radiators in between these radiators and stuff like that. But my point is that a 3.1 density is not terribly good. This motor makes 700 horsepower. Would that fit 2 of these? Yes, that would easily fit 2 of these, making 800 horsepower in the same area. And that is using over 8 fuel a second, and this would be using 2 of these would be using 0.6 fuel a second. So my point about density is to keep the power up, which is what makes it dense, you need a crap ton of radiators, which also hurt efficiency. So, you know, we can't, this really misses the point of what we're trying to do. And if you had a little bumblebee jet, we was only getting 380 or 300 and something out of a single cylinder. What you would be better off doing with your space, which that wouldn't fit in a bumblebee jet anyway, is you would be better off using 2 engine blocks with 2 cylinders on it. And you might even be able to configure this thing. I don't think it would configure any better by putting a crank on it, putting 2 cylinders. Putting a crank on would let you put 2 cylinders in a V configuration and use 1 injector and get the same power. And the exhaust would be pretty much, it might be more efficient depending on the design of your little bumblebee jet, but if each one of these was making 385 horsepower, it would still be making more power than that. So let's run these and see what they can do. And let them heat soak and let them stabilize. Okay, so it looks like they're going to be making about, we're making 385 horsepower per each cylinder, and at, you know, the 42% heat soak. So 385 times 2 is 770 horsepower with a density of 3 by 5 by 3. That's 45. So 770, and that becomes a density up 22. Okay, so where density went from crap back to good again, back to about as high as you can go. So we're making 770 horsepower, and it can run continuously, and the fuel consumption is about 10.6 because we have 2 engines running. So about 10 fuel a second, which is ridiculous because I can make 1,200, I could probably make about 15,000 horsepower on the same fuel. And actually, if I actually got into my most efficient motors, well, the problem is the most efficient motors start dropping in power, and the most powerful motors are not the most efficient. This is probably about the most. At 10 fuel, I could run 5. At 10 fuel a second, I could at least run 5 of these. That's 12,000 horsepower, which is pretty much the same as this one over here. 2 of these, so I could run 5 of these motors or 2 of those big motors, and roughly be in about the 12,000, 13,000 horsepower range. So, but like I said, we're trying to make a bumblebee jet. We don't have the room. We're not concerned about fuel economy. We're worried about space economy. But this big old monster right here, to make a little bit more power, I mean, initially it makes more power, but it eventually goes down to about, I had them balanced out a little bit. I had them balanced out to where they were exactly both 770. These radiators are doing you no good. The power that they save by having all of these radiators is not worth the what is it? This was 785. This was 770. 15 horsepower is gained by this much radiator. So this is not efficient. This is not efficient in any way, shape, or form. It's not efficient by fuel. It's not efficient by power. It's not efficient by space. So this would be more efficient, and it would be a better way to run a little bitty bumblebee jet. And it shows that radiators are not really your friend. And this is why I don't use them. Now, injectors are better. Like I said, if I have some of these motor layouts where only a carb is touching 2 cylinders, I could probably rip off the carburetors, put some injectors, and plumb all the exhaust up, get rid of all the turbos because you don't need them anymore, and get some of these densities of some of these motors through the roof, and the power would go way up. But then they would run so hot that they would lose almost half of their power. So then what is the point of having a injector that makes twice the power if they heat soak and lose over half of their power? You're better off using a carburetor which runs cooler. Radiators start becoming redundant. They don't do anything. Let me start removing this and show that I'm not just throwing 100 radiators on it to make it look over exaggerated ridiculous. I'm just going to cut one stack off of that, and this was running at 785, and see it's gone down to 776. If I cut off another row, because what we're trying to do is get the density up, right? We want to take up less space and make more power. Well, as I'm removing what's taking up all the space, now I am exaggerating a little bit the way, because I use big radiators, because I didn't want to put 300 little radiators on this thing. You see, now we're down to, we lost another 10 horsepower. So we are gaining density because we're not dropping as much horsepower as we are dropping space usage. But you notice as I use less space, we're using less power, which makes us less dense. So if this thing drops below 600 horsepower or heat soaks and overheats, then the density is not even worth it at that point. So I'm going to get rid of this whole side of radiators and see if it'll run on just 2 big ones. See, now we're at 600, so we're getting to the point where we have an extra injector on here that is not being utilized, because we should be getting 800. So let's go ahead and remove. Since we removed all the radiators, let's move the injector. And then if we remove an injector, we should still be at 600 horsepower. And we are, but for some reason, the radiators, because we're making less power, the radiators are now using more percentages of the power that we are making. And we've dropped to 5 something, so we're getting this really bad diminishing returns here. So, but we've opened up another exhaust. So watch, I'll put another exhaust on to cool the motor, and the power's going up. The power's starting to skyrocket. So the power's going back up to 700 something, and we still have radiators, which is not our most dense. So let's get rid of another radiator, and another radiator, and another radiator, with 2 exhausts and 3 injectors, and we are losing power like a fool. So we're actually losing so much power that we could take another injector off, and you see where we're going. We're right back into, we don't have a very space efficient or dense motor. Okay, so I hope that shows you guys don't want to, you really probably don't want to use injectors unless your use case is absolutely positively necessary. The density of an injector motor can be pretty good, but the fuel usage is so bad that you need so many fuel tanks that the density of the motor can't be calculated based on just the motor itself. It needs to be calculated on all the supply that it needs. And when you're drawing 10 fuel a second and 1,000 each block of fuel holds 1,000, so it could run it a little bit over a minute and a half for every block of fuel. But by the time you add in the fuel storage cost, if you had a Bumblebee jet that's holding 15,000 fuel, let's say it's all in the center of your jet, and they have an armor-piercing anti-air round that pierces through all your fuel tanks, then you lose 10,000 fuel and the thing's dead in the water. And then if it falls nowhere near where it can be resupplied fuel, even if it can repair itself and get back out of the water and get back into the fight, it's still dead in the water. So putting a lot of fuel in a little bitty area is not really a good idea. So, you know, that's the only use case scenario I can see. Injectors are pretty good. And honestly, that's not even the best, because little Bumblebee jets, other than for distracting enemies, they're not really any. They don't have enough firepower to really do anything other than just pick the scabs that your main ships are putting out. And yeah, I hope that shows you guys why I don't use Radiator. I mean, I don't use Injectors. I don't think I have a single craft that actually uses an injector. But some of you guys might want to try to use injectors for very small jets or very small boats, or for, you know, I don't know why you guys would want to use it, but I know some of them you guys keep trying to use injectors on, you know, but if your craft is that small that you need to save on your engine size and use an injector, you lose out on the fact that you need a crap ton of fuel storage, and then your range gets severely diminished because you can't get too far away from another ship to refuel it. Or if you have a bigger ship that can keep refueling it, why are you using a small little ship to begin with? Just disable it and put all those materials into a bigger ship. And to me, I just don't see the use case for it. I don't see the point in it, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But if you guys want to keep doing it, go ahead, make small motors with injectors. I think I showed you probably the best way to do it, by chaining multiple small motors together instead. And forget about radiators. They're stupid. I don't know why people use them at all. They just hurt your density, and they don't do any good for you. And I see you guys in the next one.